Everybody, hello and welcome to episode 2 of GMAT Club series on how to improve your GMAT score. Episode 1 is available on YouTube. It was on how to improve your quant score. This episode that you've come to today, right now, is on how to improve your verbal score. And stay tuned for episode 3, which is going to be about how to improve your data insights score. That one is also going to be taught by me. Hopefully that guy knows something. We shall see. Anyway, welcome. You guys comment in the chat window, say whatever you want. I'll try to get to some of your questions either at the end or as we go, but let's dive right into this. So, how to go from an average verbal score to a great verbal score is what we're talking about, right? Just for context, if anybody's come to this totally new to the GMAT, 3 sections on the GMAT. Again, quant's been dealt with, verbal's being dealt with now, data insights at a later date. Each section is equally weighted, so they all have the same weight as all the other ones, and each one's on a scale of 60 to 90. 90 being the score we're aiming for, okay? What we're going to talk about is the verbal skills really required to just do well on verbal, the kind of behind-the-scenes stuff that's going on in verbal questions. As you may know, you know it now. There are 2 question types in verbal, critical reasoning and reading comprehension. And we're going to examine both of them. And we're going to start with reading comprehension. Spoiler alert. Here's what we're looking at as an overview. This is kind of a list of all the skills required to mount a successful effort in verbal. You notice it starts with understanding purpose, of course, locating relevant information. That's kind of a big part of the test overall. Paraphrasing, summarizing, and so on. And we're going to talk about all these things in turn as to how they pertain to the passages and to the questions. Thing number 7 is something we're going to be talking about throughout. It's at the bottom of the list. It is by no means the least of that list. Differentiating right from wrong in the answer choices is the last big effort on verbal, and it's something you've got to be thinking about all the time. Every time you practice verbal, spending some time on the back end, at least differentiating between wrong and right answer choices is hugely important. And of course, you're going to be spending some time on the front end too as you try to pick the right answer, but more on that later. The review process in verbal, incredibly important. All right. So this is what we're looking at with reading comprehension and understanding purpose. Guys, it is action time. All right. Purpose is a really interesting thing because it's hard to put a finger on what the author's purpose is. It's sometimes, especially if you're kind of new to this sort of reading for the GMAT, feels like mind reading a little bit, like you're almost having to guess at what the author's thinking. And that is not how they set up these passages. There should be minimal mind reading involved because you are not expected to be psychics. You're expected to be readers, and all the information for reading comprehension has to be in the passage. But the author never comes right out and says in the passage, okay, listen up, everybody. Here's my purpose. Here's what I'm going to do. And so you do have to, in some ways, read between the lines to get the author's purpose. And purpose can be a kind of grand thing, you know, the purpose of the entire passage. It can be a slightly smaller thing, the purpose of the paragraph, but it can also be a more minute thing, the purpose of a single sentence, the purpose of a single name within a sentence, a single word within a sentence. All right. They ask about purpose explicitly, both in reading comprehension and in critical reasoning, though a little bit more in reading comprehension. And even when they're not explicitly asking about purpose, knowledge of purpose, if you're aware of the purpose of each sentence as it's coming up, helps you to understand the passage better and helps you to answer every kind of question in reading comprehension better and critical reasoning. But we'll get there. That's later. Don't even need to talk about it. All right. So take a look at this first sentence of a passage. And I've kept this passage on the shorter side so that we can all enjoy it together. During and immediately after a war, Hollywood films typically trumpet the glory of sacrifice and unquestioning patriotism. And sit with it for a moment. Because you can tell a lot from that sentence about what the passage might be about, right? Like, there's a good chance we're talking about something to do with war, something to do with Hollywood films, maybe something to do with the glory of sacrifice and unquestioning patriotism, right? But there's a pretty strong emphasis on the Hollywood films because they're the subject of the sentence, and grammar really does come into play in how you understand reading comprehension, especially. Subject of the sentence, it's got a strong claim. But the fact is, we don't know really right now what the author's purpose is. We don't know what thread the author is going to pull on from this sentence. It's pretty likely that the author is not going to immediately pivot to, and basketball was also great, or something like that, right? The author is going to, in the next sentence, have to in some way build upon this sentence. And that right there is the single most important thing about these reading comprehension passages in terms of how you read them. You have to go in with the implicit trust that each sentence is meaningfully connected to every sentence around it, right? Just like in a quant word problem, each given is meaningfully connected to the other givens in some way, or otherwise you'd have no way to assemble the problem and get it right, right? They're not leaving anything to chance. They're not leaving anything to doubt in these passages, and they're pretty well edited passages. So there aren't errant sentences just saying some random thing before they come back to the point. Every sentence is in some way on point. Now, that is not to say they don't sometimes, often, contain extra information that you kind of have to ignore. And of course, overall, the passage is going to contain more information than is likely to be asked about in the questions that come with the passage, right? So there is definitely going to be some superfluous information that you're given. But from kind of an editor's perspective, these passages are tight. Every sentence does have a purpose. And the way you get that purpose is by noting how the sentence connects to the sentence that came before it and to the sentence that came after it. So the first sentence alone often doesn't give you a good sense of the author's overall purpose in the passage. But what it does do is give you a sense of the likely thing we're talking about, the topic of the passage, right? And you look to the second sentence to see, okay, got some raw materials here. Where's the author going to take them? Right? And you've got to read now the second sentence in context of the first. And this kind of like close read, why has the second sentence come here after the first, is really important in the beginning of a passage because it's really in the first few sentences of most passages that you're going to get a sense of the author's overall purpose in the passage. And once you have that, it becomes less important that you totally get everything else in the passage. Once you've got the overall thrust of the passage, you have a sense of where the author is going. The details afterwards become less important because you have a framework in which to place them. All right, that makes for easy retrieval, and it makes for an easier time on the harder purpose-based or inference-based questions. All right, so take a look at the second sentence now. 10 to 15 years later, however, morally fraught and sometimes pacifistic movies about the conflict typically emerge. All right. Looked at in the context of the first sentence, the thread that the authors decided to pick up on, the thing that gets repeated in the second sentence from the first sentence, is essentially movies, right? Movies mirrors films from the first sentence, and conflict. Conflict mirroring war from the first sentence. And that gives you a pretty good sense that we do want to talk about movies here. The authors brought them up twice now in a row. And we don't want to talk about just any movies. It doesn't look like Jurassic Park's going to be coming into this one because we've got now in just these two sentences this movement from during and immediately after a war, Hollywood films do something. 10 to 15 years later, however, movies are doing something else, right? And you know it's something else. Like you can get caught up in the words really easily in these passages, right? Pacifistic, you might look at and say, not totally sure I use the word pacifistic on a daily basis. I'm not totally sure I know exactly what it means. That happens in a lot of these passages. As those of you who've been studying for a while know, that can happen in like science passages. They hit you with words you've never heard of before. Norepinephrine, you guys made that up. All right. So there's some hard words in here, but the most important word in this sentence, besides these words that clearly tie this sentence to the previous sentence, the most important word in this sentence for understanding the author's purpose is the word however. Because that, however, on its own, wherever it might have been placed in this sentence, that, however, on its own tells you this sentence is setting up a contrast with the previous sentence of some kind, right? This sentence is not saying, actually, that previous sentence was wrong. It's not straight contradicting the previous sentence, but it is setting up a contrast. And so if you've understood the first sentence, but you struggle a bit with the second sentence, you can use that understanding of the first sentence and the fact that you can see the author's trying to make a bit of a contrast here to get a better understanding of the second sentence, right? If the first sentence is about how the films typically trumpet the glory of sacrifice and unquestioning patriotism, then you can kind of infer that when the author talks about morally fraught and sometimes pacifistic movies, that morally fraught and pacifistic probably meant to contrast things that trumpet the glory of sacrifice and unquestioning patriotism, right? And if you really dig into the details, you can see close correspondences between those things. So even the new stuff in this sentence, the stuff that wasn't in the previous sentence, morally fraught, pacifistic, is still in some way tied to the previous sentence. And the however is the mediator. Transition words, however, looking at the beginning of the next sentence, for example, indeed, furthermore, any number of things like that, they give you your best insight into what the author's thinking in bringing up a sentence, why the author's actually doing it. For example, this third sentence starts for example, right? And it's pretty clear, I think, from just those two words. We're about to get an example of something the author said before, right? Perhaps we're going to get an example of what happens during and immediately after a war. Perhaps we're going to get something about these morally fraught and sometimes pacifistic movies that come out 10 to 15 years later. But we know we're going to get an example. And in terms of figuring out the author's purpose, on a small scale level, the author's purpose in this third sentence is to give an example of something. But on the grander scale, you ask yourself, why would the author even want to give an example of this? It tells you that probably the author is kind of going to continue down this line through the passage, right? The author has laid out this thing that happens with films during war, films after war, and then is kind of launching into an example. And take a look at the examples it comes out. After America joined World War I in 1917, the still infant film industry glorified the fight against the Hun. What is that an example of? Anybody feeling comfortable? Tell me in the chat window. Example of stuff from the first sentence or example of stuff from the second sentence, or can't be sure right now? Remember, guys, questions you have along the way, things you want to talk about. Chat window, place to be. All right. You pick up from the theme of the sentence. What is this sentence kind of talking about? Some of the words in the sentence and how they might echo either the first sentence or the second sentence. We have after America joined World War I in 1917. Now, do they mean 10 to 15 years after, the way the second sentence is talking about, or do they mean like right after America joined World War I in 1917? It may not be clear from there, right? Then it says the still infant film industry glorified the fight against the Hun. And so if you're not totally sure what time frame they're really talking about when they say after America joined World War I in 1917, yeah, as Jade says in chat, we're getting an example of glorification, glorifying a fight against someone, right? And that seems to be a lot more in line with the first sentence. So the author is given this first sentence about what happens in movies during a war. Second sentence about what happens 10 to 15 years later. And the author's hit us with an example right now. And it's clear from context clues and parallels, this is an example of the first kind of thing. And the more engaged you are in this process in these first few sentences, the more you can almost predict what's to come, or at least whatever comes next is very unlikely to be a surprise, right? You guys might well be thinking right now, I kind of expect this next sentence to continue the thought, right? And if you're not sure, the first few words of a sentence will pretty much give the whole game away, right? Because again, these are pretty well edited passages. They're not trying to be coy or really mysterious about what direction they're going in. They're trying to be fairly organized, structured, connected, right? So this sentence starts with a but. Pretty strong transition word right there. Lets you know you're getting a contrast. And given what's come before it, if you were expecting a sentence to follow up this glorification of the fight against the Hun with something that's maybe more morally fraught, maybe even pacifistic, it's exactly what you get. And there, my friends, is the rest of the passage. I know you've been dying to see it. I know you've been like, no, I really want to figure out where this author's going. It's yours now. It is in your capable hands. Notice that in that fourth sentence, you get kind of what you probably expect, especially from the word but. The word but mirrors the word however in that second sentence. And this sentence mirrors the relationship the second sentence had to the first sentence, right? By the early 1930s, within the 10 to 15 year time frame after 1917, films such as All Quiet on the Western Front, and even if you don't read the rest of the sentence, you can be guaranteed that the author is going to say something about it's bringing up something morally fraught or pacifistic, right? And of course, did not shy away from depicting the horrors of combat and the disillusionment of soldiers. Now notice, that doesn't actually say morally fraught. It doesn't say anything about morals here, and it doesn't specifically say anything about pacifism, right? But because of the structure, because of how sentences 3 and 4 clearly parallel sentences 1 and 2, you can make that connection. And that right there is a lot of the inference that goes into figuring out an author's purpose in writing these sentences and writing these passages. Okay? Now, where does it all lead to? Questions. It all leads to questions, always. With regards to purpose, as I mentioned, there are some grand scale purpose questions. There are some very small scale purpose questions. We're going to get an example of each of these. And if you guys want to take 30 seconds to a minute to look at these answers, if you guys are feeling so bold that you're willing to put something in the chat window, lay it on the line for all of YouTube to see what you think the answer might be, go for it. Either way, I'll give you a chance to look at these answer choices, tangle them a bit. Had a little while to look at them. And of course, keep looking at them, keep making a decision if you dare. But I'm going to start going down them one by one. All right, because essentially you can break reading comprehension down into 3 major categories of improvement. Improving how you read, what we're just talking about, a way to read attentively for purpose and stuff like that. Getting to know the different question types and what they really want from you on those questions. And then the answer choices. And at the end of it all, the better and better you get, the more it's going to be just about the answer choices. The more you're going to find yourself getting it narrowed down to 2 and having trouble choosing between them. And as long as you're attentive to those answer choices in the review process, you'll get better and better at making the right choice there. It's a great question, Jade, and I appreciate it. It is a bit too strong. And I'm thinking it's the word only that's jumped out at you about that one, right? Only is absolutely problematic in that one. And this is exactly what you're looking for, by the way, when you go through the answers, whether it's on review or when you're first going through the answers, right? Essentially, when you're practicing, you should go through the answers, pick your answer. You're going to have a reason for it, or a reason you eliminated the other answers. You check the answer and you find out you got it wrong. Take one more crack at it before you go to an explanation. All right, why was this one that I picked ultimately wrong? What do I think they're going to say in the explanation? And why is this one they say is right actually right? Nice. Excellent. Excellent. Jade, you're right on the money. All right, let's go down this list of answer choices for demonstration purposes. And this is kind of the like review / choosing phase of it. So, excuse me, we want the main point made by the author, which means we want a short, fairly generic statement that does its best to cover the entire passage or as much of the passage as possible. Trap answers will be answers that focus on just a tiny part of the passage or that go a bit too grand for what the passage can really support or for what the passage is really about. And then there are, of course, going to be some answers that just say the wrong things. All right. So looking at A, cultural and artistic communities tend not to fully support armed conflicts. So a huge part of how you read the passages and how you read the answer choices and how we're going to do critical reasoning is connections, right? Each part of this answer either connects to something in the passage or doesn't. And you're often going to have to work in a primary purpose question and make those connections because they use such generic language. Cultural and artistic communities might be a reference to filmmakers or something like that, right? But it's notable that like they seem to just be talking about film, at least in the first 4 sentences of the passage. I don't know. I haven't read the rest. And cultural and artistic communities then feels a bit grand for that. Like that's one cultural and artistic community, but can we extrapolate from what they're saying about films here to cultural and artistic communities overall? Not really. And this is one of the things you come to know the more questions you see, where the GMAT draws the line between an acceptable stretch and an unacceptable stretch. A is a bit too broad. It's broadening the scope from one community to many, and it is unfortunately just not going to work out for us. There's also the issue that like some of these films seem to support armed conflicts, even though some other ones don't, right? So in taking just one side of it, A's backed itself into a bad corner. B, in the last century, the film industry has become more culturally diverse. Maybe, but there was nothing about cultural diversity mentioned in the first 4 sentences, and it would be weird to like save that and pop it on you later. And if you read the rest of the passage, which I assume some of you have, you see that cultural diversity is not really the thing that's being talked about here, right? We're really stay focused on films and their relationship to war and this funny phenomenon whereby during a war, the films like the war, but after a war, the films are like, are we sure we like the war? And so culturally diverse misses the mark. But as Jade suggests, C's a real winner. The existence of a particular cultural pattern can be established via evidence from 20th century films. So every part of C has to be apt to the passage for C to be right for a primary purpose question. Is there evidence from 20th century films? Yeah, we get reference to films in 1917, 1930s, 1950s, right? 1960s. And that's a pretty good swath of the 20th century, right? So evidence from 20th century films justified here, right? The existence of a particular cultural pattern. Now, that's again fairly generic wording, but if we try to connect it to something we know from the passage, could we be talking about the thing laid out in the first 2 sentences? What happens during and immediately after a war versus what happens 10 to 15 years later? We look through the passage, that's what the examples mirror every time, right? World War I has examples that glorified and then examples that were more morally fraught. World War II, examples that glorified, examples that were more morally fraught. Vietnam War, examples that glorified, examples that were more morally fraught. So indeed, we have this pattern laid out in general terms in the first 2 sentences, and then we have example after example that seems to be providing evidence that that is indeed a pattern. And so the particular cultural pattern, totally justified. You can articulate exactly what it is. That it exists seems to be the case because it is established with all this evidence. And so every part of C is right? No word in C really sets foot out of line. And C is generic enough that it covers the whole passage. That is the pattern we're examining through many examples throughout the passage. And so C ends up being very much the winner. D, as mentioned before, only supports military efforts while the actual conflict is taking place. Probably isn't quite right because we just can't say it for sure. The author has noted that there's this pattern here, but maybe the author's cherry-picked. Maybe maybe there are other times in like the 18th century or 19th century when that was different. Don't know that the film industry was that great then, but you never know. Magic lanterns. Either way, it only makes it a bit strong and kind of misses the dynamic in the passage, whereby the author wants to talk about during war, after war, during war, after war, right? That's the pattern that carries throughout the passage, a kind of A and B thing all throughout, right? And so D, in only talking about while the actual conflict is taking place, is not that great. It's not that bad either. D is definitely the best trap answer here, but the only does ruin it. That is an answer that is too extreme, too restrictive. Then E, cyclical patterns determine the type of films produced by Hollywood more than individuals do. So there are cyclical patterns, it would seem. Cyclical may be a bit off, right? It seems to be more circumstantial, but either way, we could call it cyclical. And there seems to be some sort of pattern maybe determining the kinds of films produced by Hollywood. But more than individuals do is going to be still problematic because there's never been any comparison made between patterns versus what individuals can do in determining the type of films produced, right? And so this one's one that like tries to front load some good information there and make itself tempting, but that ultimately fails in that comparison at the end. It makes false comparison and it's calling out something that's not really in the passage. Great question. So it does use only examples from 20th century films. You're right. The existence of the cultural pattern like could be long-standing and could, you know, be a forever thing. The answer choice is agnostic about that. And the first two sentences are a bit agnostic about that, right? But there's no doubt that the evidence that they established to justify that cultural pattern is from 20th century films. And there's kind of an outside knowledge component whereby you might say Hollywood films, well, films are, it's widely known, a comparatively recent phenomenon, but they don't say it in the passage and it doesn't need to be assumed to make the answer work. This is exactly right. And so like, yeah, the first sentence doesn't necessarily say it's only a 20th century pattern and C doesn't either, basically just that the evidence is. Yep. There it is. So reviewing verbal questions is how you actually get better. I mean, practice and exposure are good. They're always good. But reviewing, putting into words why each answer is wrong, what kind of traps are present, and especially paying attention to which kinds of trap answers you're vulnerable to, that's really important to getting better. Because when you get to the test, when you're going for that 90, it's going to come down to some tough decisions at the end of the day between two answer choices. And your ability to talk yourself out of picking that wrong one and into picking the right one is everything at that point. You have to know the test well, how it uses language. You have to know yourself well and what kind of bad answers you've been tempted by in the past. And maybe you have a little bit of luck. I don't know. It should be pretty cut and dry, but I'll be honest, it never feels quite that way. I always get into a jam at least a time or two on any given verbal section because they make some really tough calls sometimes, right? More. Let's see more. We're going to cruise through the passage now. We're a lot more familiar with it. So this is an example of another way they can ask about purpose. And slightly more common because, you know, they will only ever really ask one primary purpose question about a passage, and they don't ask one about every passage. But specific purpose questions, you can ask multiple ones in a passage. You can have them passage after passage, and so on. For what purpose does the author include the second sentence of the passage? You have to, of course, look at that in the context of the other sentences and in the context of the purpose of whatever paragraph it's in, if it's a multi-paragraph passage, and the purpose of the passage as a whole. This would have been a hard one to answer if we hadn't read the whole passage, if we just read the sentence too, because we didn't really know what the main idea of the passage was. But in these answer choices, this one really goes for what is its relationship to the rest of the passage. And if you've already established what the main purpose of the passage is, it ends up being surprisingly easy, perhaps, to choose an answer here. Take a look at those answer choices. I'll give you like 20 seconds so it doesn't get too awkward. Going once. Going twice. Is Jade a winner again? The answer is yes. She did so, and I cannot possibly disagree. All right, yeah, A is absolutely the one. Part of a description of a pattern that is the main point of discussion in the passage. We kind of already know what the main point is. It's to discuss a certain pattern. And the second sentence is indeed part of the description of that pattern. The first sentence is the other part of the description of that pattern, right? And so, again, every part of answer A is justified. There's not a single part of it, not a single noun that really goes astray. Whereas in B, example. Sentence 3, heck yeah, example. Sentence 2, not offering an example. An example is a specific thing, right? And so that ruins it for C as well. Illustrates a belief. Kind of. Like, this brings us to another thing, author's voice, right? Lots of passages have the author quoting other people, putting out other people's ideas and stuff like that. And lots of passages have the author putting out their own ideas, whatever they may be, right? So the thing to look for is, has the author cited anybody who said this, right? It's random scholar has noted a pattern in these films. In this case, no, it's just, there is a pattern. And 10 to 15 years later, here's what happens, right? When the author hasn't cited anybody else in saying stuff like that, it's the author's own voice and it's the author's own belief then, it's fair to say. At that point, it's not yet totally been substantiated, and it is kind of a position that's being taken, not necessarily a fact at the point at which it's brought up. So illustrates a belief is pretty fair indeed. That the author of the passage, well, that one's a given, does not hold to be valid. Boom. That's, of course, where D goes wrong, because the author gives plenty of evidence that backs up this belief that's being outlined in the second sentence. And so D fails in the ending part, much like E failed at the ending part in the last question. This is the other thing you're looking for in analyzing answer choices. What patterns can you see? Where do you see them doing the same kinds of wrong answers? And there are certain types that come up time and time again. Opposites, extremes, like we saw with only in the last question. Ending wrong, like front-loading the good stuff, which we see in D here and E in the last question. One word wrong. Lots of ways they can make answers wrong, but not an unlimited variety of ways that they can make an answer that's both wrong and tempting. All right. And the more you can put names on those patterns you're seeing, the more you can put names on what they're doing to make these answers tricky, the easier it becomes to recognize them going forward. That's just part of how brains work. You can name something, you can more easily pick it out, distinguish it in the future. And that, especially for those trap answers that you find yourself getting caught by, makes you more inoculated against getting caught by them in other problems. Right? E provides evidence. I mean, not exactly. Evidence is usually going to be, again, factual stuff, and this is more of a belief than evidence. But even then, it's also kind of part of the author's main contention rather than evidence that the main contention is true. So E is a bit like B in its import here, and not great. Right? Understanding purpose is huge on these things. Now, locating relevant information, not such a big thing in purpose questions unless they specifically call out sentence 2 or a detail from the passage. Then you got to locate that specific information and read around it, or know just generally how it fits in with the purpose. But I'd usually say read around it, right? Paragraph 2, even to get that answer right, did have to be understood in the context of paragraph 1. Or sorry, sentence 2 had to be understood in the context of sentence 1. Paraphrasing and summarizing. Detecting point of view, we just talked about. Comparison and contrast. Absolutely a case. And you can call that also more like parallels versus kind of contradictions. We see a lot of that in this kind of A versus B passage. A lot of the A things are saying the same. During a war, there's glorification of war. And then a lot of the B things were saying a contrasting thing. 10 to 15 years later, people are like, yeah, but really, war? And so comparison and contrast it's going to come up a lot in passages. And it's going to come up in wrong answers too. You might recall that one of the trap answers in the first question was wrong because it made a comparison that wasn't in the passage. So don't overplay the passage's hands-on comparisons, but passages do make a lot of comparisons and contrast, and comparing two sentences to each other and seeing the contrast, you might recall, was how we teased out a lot of information from just even the first two sentences of the passage. Gauging level of certainty, or you could call it like level of extremeness or something like that, also important because so many answers are too extreme, right? If the author is, giving you a maybe in the passage, you can't have an answer that says it's a probably or a certainly or something like that. You can always have a correct answer that's less certain than the passage. All right. So if the passage says probably, you can have an answer that says maybe. You can never have an answer that's more certain. And so getting a sense of the author's level of certainty when communicating things is really important to distinguishing between right and wrong answers as well, and getting a sense of the answer choice's level of certainty, the level of extremeness they are going to. That's the other part of that puzzle, really. Now, this stuff comes up even more in true detail questions, right? So according to the passage is the most kind of general detail-oriented type. They're basically in these questions just asking you to report on what you see in the passage. Locating relevant information going to be very important. And for that, either if you're a note taker, taking some notes on the passage might help, or skimming very effectively for keywords from the question stem or from the answer choices might help, or just remembering or kind of sensing from purpose, it's probably going to be here. Like if you know the purpose of each paragraph in a longer passage and they're asking you about a detail, you probably know, yeah, that detail could have only come up in that paragraph because it wouldn't make sense anywhere else, that sort of thing. So you can use your knowledge of the passage or any notes or your incredible skimming skills to track down details. Now, an accept question is always notoriously annoying because it often means that you're going to have to track down a lot of detail in the passage, right? Like almost each answer choice, going down it and seeing it. But if you remember things well from the passage, you may not need to. It's usually a good idea to go to the passage and confirm. The nice thing about according to the passage questions, though, is 9 times out of 10, you're not going to have to really like infer anything. There might be a little bit of paraphrasing, there might be a little bit of summarizing or some synonyms in the answer choices, but we've already seen that in purpose questions where they very deliberately use much more generic language in the answer choices than they've used in the passage, right? So nothing really new here. I'm seeing Jade coming through with an answer, and I trust Jade implicitly. So it's gonna be hard for any answer here to beat E. But let's see. According to the passage, the combat depicted in All Quiet on the Western Front resembles the depiction of combat in all of the following except. And so here's another way that purpose can help, right? If you know what the author's purpose was in bringing up All Quiet on the Western Front, if you know what part of the pattern that fit into, right? Is that part of the A group of war glory, or is it part of the B group of pacifism and moral fraughtness? Right? I don't know. Either way, placing that well, understanding the author's purpose and bringing it up can really help with this, especially if you know some other things that were on the same side as that, right? So we find All Quiet on the Western Front. It's in that fourth sentence that starts, but by the early 1930s. And if you read it in the context of the second sentence, or third sentence rather, you might remind yourself, oh yeah, third sentence is about like the during war movies glorifying. Gotta get that on. Fourth sentence with its but must be about the other side of the coin, the later, morally complicated movies, right? So the combat depicted there, right? Apparently combat full of horrors and full of disillusioned soldiers. Combat depicted there resembles the depiction of combat in all of the following except. 4 of them, it's going to resemble the depiction of combat, and 1, no. And so what you really want to see, especially in these like named ones down here, is are all of those 3 movies on the morally fraught side, or are they on the war glory side? Bridge on the River Kwai is part of a by 1957 though, right? And this comes after a sentence about World War II beginning, right? And in that sentence, Guadalcanal Diary is there, right? So Guadalcanal Diary is positioned as a movie that's a during war movie, right? A type A movie from this passage. It's on the A side of this A-B divide. Bridge on the River Kwai, on the other hand, well after World War II, by 1957, the though give that away in a major way, right? And if not, depicting the moral confusion inherent in war would seal the deal beyond any shadow of a doubt, right? All right, so it's not going to be Bridge on the River Kwai. It's almost certainly going to be Guadalcanal Diary, very much because Jade said it was, and I trust her. You should too. No, because obviously it's one of the during war movies, and that's not what All Quiet on the Western Front really is. Platoon is said to be more complex and ambivalent, right? And is, if you look at it in the context of the previous sentence, counterposition to the Green Berets, which was the during war movie of the Vietnam War. And so Platoon's on the same side as All Quiet. Films that portray the ethical complexities of war is, of course, kind of right there in the overall pattern and purpose of the passage. And some films from the 1950s, we already saw that in Bridge on the River Kwai. So, yes, some films just means one or more. Some is a very safe word. Incorrect answers, usually, on reading comprehension. This is an except, so that some films is true to the passage, but is not what we want. We want the one that's not true to the passage. And indeed, Guadalcanal Diary is it. Knowing the author's purpose in bringing up everything, being able to quickly remind yourself of the author's purpose in looking at a sentence, comparing it to the sentence that came just before it or after it, can help not just with purpose questions, but literally with all questions. All right, purpose is at the heart of reading comprehension. Now, let's kick it up a notch. Because the other thing that's at the heart of reading comprehension, and indeed the entire test, is logical inference. All right. Comes up in reading comprehension. It comes up to some degree in critical reasoning in like straight inference questions, though that's not a super prevalent type in critical reasoning. Certainly inference skills are still very much on display and used in critical reasoning, as are purpose skills. But you're going to see a lot more reading comprehension questions pushing you to make logical inferences and data insights questions. More on that in a little while, as in next session. Those are the three real types of inference they get at in reading comprehension, especially in true inference questions. Very mathematical, logical things. Remember, this is a standardized test. They're not expecting you to conjecture, to guess at things. In reading comprehension, they're not expecting you to draw on outside knowledge, nothing like that. And so if they're asking you what can be inferred, what they're really asking you is, which of these answers is as true as something that was said in the passage, right? A reformulation of it in the way that, like, you know, A lives less than C is a reformulation of those two first pieces of information, or that B is greater than A in the second line, converse, is a reformulation of A is less than B. Application, always a bit of a tough one, and to be honest, the GMAT separates application from inference and how they present it in the official guide. But application is usually, when it's done safely, choosing a specific thing from a bigger group, right? So like if I tell you that A is greater than 0, you can infer from that A is not -5, right? That's a bit of converse. You're talking about what A is not when I told you it's greater than 0, but it's also a bit of application. You could have said A is not negative, and that would have been a lot more broad, general, and inclusive. But to choose just the specific value of -5 out of that infinite range of negative values is a good example of application. Application comes up in a lot of other inference questions, and sometimes it gets asked about on its own, especially when the test gives you kind of general rules or principles for something and then asks, so what's a specific case that exemplifies what we're talking about there? Still, synthesis and converse are your workhorses. They're the ones that come up time and time again. They're the ones that get involved in the quant section, in the data insight section, and everything. Application, the sad little brother of the group. All right. Inference questions are usually detail-based, and they can ask things like, what would the author agree with? Or they can ask what can be inferred about a specific thing. Or they can just ask in a very open-ended way, which of the following can be inferred from the passage, in which case you're really chasing down details in each answer choice and seeing if they can be inferred. This one, though, calls out a specific detail. The passage implies which of the following about the message portrayed in the movie Bridge on the River Kwai. And so it's cool. You can skim for it. You probably remember where it is at this point because it came up in the last question. Not, you'll find it pretty quickly because it's italicized, and that does make things a little bit easier to find. You go, you read around it, because whenever you're asked about a detail, you don't just read that detail, you got to read the context, right, for that purpose thing. So what have they said about the bridge on the River Kwai? So many things. First published in book form in 1952. It came out in 1957, I guess, or it came out by 1957 would be safer to say. It won awards. It depicted the moral confusion inherent in war. Also in the context of the wider passage, it's part of these later morally fraught pacifist type movies, right? It contrasts Guadalcanal Diary, and maybe it's dealing with World War II and stuff like that. All right, 2 votes for D. Pretty good. Pretty good, not gonna lie. Take a look at all these ones in order. It supports the author's view that it's better to depict the full complexities and moral confusions of conflict than to pretend that sacrifice is always worthwhile. Why not that one if D is going to be the answer? Because the author never says that it is better, right? And a correct answer can never overplay the author's hand. It can never make the author more opinionated than the author actually was in the passage. A correct answer can never make the author seem more opinionated or portray the author as more opinionated. The author never says one way is better than the other. The author just says, hey, here's a pattern I noticed. Look at all these examples. Crazy, right? And it can be easy to read into the passage, oh, well, maybe, the author bringing up this moral complexity and stuff. Complexity, that's usually a good thing for these art things, right? And so maybe it is better. It's easy for us as readers to have a reaction to that, maybe have a bias toward it, right? But the author never expresses any sort of bias to one side or the other. I could not tell you coming away from this passage which of these was the author's favorite movie. I could tell you which was the question writer's favorite movie, though. That's Bridge on the River Kwai. Guaranteed. Guaranteed. And so it is better ascribes to the author an opinion that was never actually expressed. And that is not what they're looking for in inference. They're not looking for you to get the vibe necessarily and transmit that vibe to an answer. It's got to be specifically and explicitly justified. It put forward the pioneering portrayal of the moral confusion of war. Well, it definitely put forward something about the moral confusion inherent in war, right? So they're trying to make B look like a tempting answer here by talking about portrayal of the moral confusion of war. That part of B you can sign off on 100%. That part's okay. You might notice I break these answer choices in 2 chunks because that's the only way to process them. Trying to take them all at once, hard. Easy to lose small details, right? It put forward the pioneering is kind of the colorful word in that, right? Pioneering is not a word you see every day, and it means something pretty specific, right? A pioneering portrayal would be first leading portrayal, right? The one that got it all started, the one that was ahead of the rest. And that's probably not a great fit because we know that earlier in this pattern, as the author describes it, All Quiet on the Western Front was maybe doing some similar things, right? Either way, even if, they never said really, the author never said anything about moral confusion necessarily in All Quiet on the Western Front. It's there by it's parallel to sentence 2, but it's not actually said. But even then, if nothing kind of positive or affirmative is said about the Bridge on the River Kwai being the pioneering portrayal, then it's going to be really impossible to justify something like B that makes it seem so, right? Bit too strong, bit too rah-rah about this portrayal. All right, can't justify it. See, it represented a more realistic depiction of war than did the message in Guadalcanal Diary. A and C are usually pretty tempting answers in this one. And in this case is no exception. I know at least one person picked A here, right? It's got a lot of good things going for it. It's that framing around better. C as well. It's definitely in the passage being contrasted with Guadalcanal Diary, right? And C and D both make a bit of a contrast, play a contrast, right? And so the question is, which one gets it right? Kind of ignoring all the stuff about like framing it as a comparison with Guadalcanal Diary, one saying more realistic and one saying negative aspects, right? The rest of the words are more or less the same. Avoir, more so than did the message, more than did the message in Guadalcanal Diary. So those two answers are like pretty identical to each other. The only real difference between them is this, and you come to the passage and look for which one is better justified. And why is negative here better justified than realistic? It is. But this sentence about the bridge on the River Kwai never says that these things, like it says moral confusion inherent in more, but it never calls that a negative. And yet D is the right answer. Why is negative justified here? Only by its being positioned in contrast to Guadalcanal Diary, right? That sentence about Guadalcanal Diary says that it portrayed the ultimate sacrifice as a noble and undisputed good, while diminishing the ethical complexities, as you do. And right from by 1957, though, you know you're getting something then that is not expressing the ultimate sacrifice or portraying the ultimate sacrifice as a noble and undisputed good. And given that the bridge on the River Kwai is such contrast to Guadalcanal Diary, and given that Guadalcanal Diary was showing it as an undisputed good, just the fact that we're bringing moral confusion into it is definitely a step down from undisputed good, right? And the only way it can be a step down from undisputed good is if there's some bad in it. So this is a bit of a converse, right? We have to look at the undisputed good that they ascribe to Guadalcanal Diary, know that Bridge on the River Kwai contrasts it, and so say, okay, then Bridge on the River Kwai is less undisputed good stuff, right? And less undisputed good stuff, converse, more not so good stuff, more negative stuff. And D it is. Doesn't say anything about realism unless you assume things, right? Unless you assume that, hey, it's not very realistic to portray it as an undisputed good. It's way more realistic to portray it as morally confused, but you can't. You can't really bring that into it. You've got to draw it out from the words that are really there. All right. And that's how you decide negative aspect over more realistic. And then finally, more similar in tone to the message in Apocalypse Now than to the message in All Quiet on the Western Front. We don't know because these are all, of course, on the same side. All Quiet on the Western Front's on the B side. Apocalypse Now is on the B side, just for different wars. And so this is kind of a false comparison. Not so different from a detail question and not so different from a purpose question. You're still going back usually for specific details. You're still reading around it to get a sense of it. But this is definitely one in which our answer to a question about a thing in one sentence is coming largely from a thing that was said in another sentence, right? And that's the thing they can do when they make sure that all the sentences are connected meaningfully to each other. And that, again, is why reading for those connections is so important. All right. Now, I'm going to finish by talking about some critical reasoning because 'tis important. 'Tis important. There are certain things on this list that are very specifically about critical reasoning, right? And then there are lots of things that are about both. Real world inference, something you basically never do in reading comprehension unless you're given like a strengthened question or a weakened question or another critical reasoning style question in a reading comp passage, happens like usually about once per test. It can happen. But in every other reading comprehension inference question, you're looking for logical, necessary, certain inferences, right? Real world inference is much more like what we just do on the day-to-day, right? Like, if I tell you that I eat significantly more seaweed than my wife, right? Real world inference might be, that dude really likes seaweed, right? Why would he even be talking about that? Is he proud of his seaweed consumption? He must really like seaweed. Is he an urchin? All very fair real world inferences, right? But that wouldn't fly as a logical inference, right? All you can logically infer from the fact that I eat more seaweed than my wife is wife, I do eat some seaweed, and she eats less seaweed than I eat, right? Just two things that are pretty clearly facts implied by that. And then the converse, I eat more than she does, she eats less than I do. But in critical reasoning, it gets a lot more interesting, and that's specifically true in strengthen, weaken, and evaluate the argument questions, in which the answer choices are going to be so anecdotal and so indirectly connected to the argument that you have to bridge them usually to the argument with some real world, like, oh yeah, in the real world, this is how this would likely play out, right? An example is here. Company X offers higher wages than company Y. It's meant to be kind of understood in critical reasoning questions in the answer choices that people might see that as a draw to work at company X over company Y. It's not to be understood that people will definitely all go to work at company X and never go to work at company Y, because that would be way too extreme, right? But they present things in a way that, like, you're meant to draw on kind of real world notions to go along with and to understand and to interpret well. All right, so real world inference comes up a lot in CR and the assumption based questions. And that brings us on to the other major skill that's in critical reasoning and not in reading comprehension, and that's assumption. The big difference between critical reasoning and reading comprehension is that reading comprehension has everything there, and you just kind of need to read sentences in the context of other sentences, make parallels and connections and stuff like that, but it's all there, right? In critical reasoning questions, at least in the assumption family, find the assumption, strengthen the argument, weaken the argument, evaluate the argument, and controversial, but I'll put resolve a discrepancy in there. There is something deliberately missing from the passage, and the right answer is going to deal with that missing information in some way. All right. So that's the biggest difference between critical reasoning and reading comprehension in terms of how you're approaching it, how you're thinking about right answers. And the consequence of that is right answers on most critical reasoning questions do include new information that wasn't in the passage, and that you have to, through real world inference and just understanding of general principles and formulas, connect to the argument. All right. Now, that's not to say critical reasoning doesn't test all those same skills. Again, it does. Reading the arguments requires an understanding of purpose. Every sentence in the passage is there for a purpose, and there are even critical reasoning questions that ask about the author's purpose. In fact, here's one now. Every boldface question, just about every boldface question you'll ever see, is the same as a specific purpose question from reading comprehension. They're asking why the author brought up those boldface portions in the context of the argument. This is not, by the way, an official EA practice question. That's just an old tag. This is our beloved manatee question. That manatee, it eats seaweed too. All right. But this is a minority in critical reasoning. Boldface questions, inference questions, true inference questions, together even, taken together, they usually constitute a minority. About 3 questions or so of your critical reasoning per test, maybe 4 if they're lucky. The rest of them are all like this manatee passage, which, as you can tell, I've been dying to get to. In critical reasoning, you know what you're doing from, the middle part here. Which of the following, if true, most strongly supports the argument above, tells you it's a strengthened question. Which of the following, if true, tells you you're getting new information down in the answer choices, and you just have to take it all as completely true. It's not a question of whether it's true. It's a question of whether it's relevant to the passage and it's doing the right thing for the passage. But doing the right thing for the passage, supporting the argument above, requires a pretty purpose-based understanding of the passage, right? And that means understanding why each sentence is there the same way. Now, some of you have seen critical reasoning before, probably know, you're looking really for the conclusion of the argument above all else. When you're like trying to understand the purpose of sentences in a passage, in critical reasoning, conclusion is the most important thing. But everything has a purpose. Everything there is like answering a secret question or responding to a secret thing that the author was like worried about or thought you might be worried about, right? So everything there has a purpose. It's not purely there to distract or anything like that, right? And they can be read initially in very much the same way as reading comprehension passages can, right? First sentence gives you some background, lets you know, hey, we're talking about the West Indian manatee right now. Incidentally, distant relative of the elephant. Who would have guessed? And returned to the sea some 50 million years ago. So not exactly topical news, right? But good to know. Hard to say where it's going from there, because this doesn't seem like it's going to be the basis of an argument, really, unless the author is like, or so some people think. But no, in the second sentence, we get, these 1,000-pound herbivores inhabit the warm coastal waters of the US, where people like to play. Can confirm. Can confirm. I'm in the US. And once we finish this up, I'm playing the rest of the day. That's what's happening. Now, this still seems to be giving us some more background on manatees, right? But we are like getting deeper into the argument, and so it's more likely that we're going to have important stuff coming up here, right? Just hard to say how it's important yet, because we haven't read the rest of the argument. Next thing says, despite conservation efforts, which is never a good start to a sentence, right? Because you already kind of know how it's going to end. If it's starting with despite conservation efforts, our friend the manatee is in trouble. Despite criminal penalties for harming these creatures, and an overabundance of Save the Manatee bumper stickers in all caps, so you know they mean it, none of these animals can be considered safe. That right there is seemingly the conclusion, right? Like, this is the author going out on a limb a little bit. Certainly the first sentence wasn't the conclusion, because that is probably a fact. Looks like the second sentence isn't a conclusion either, because again, it's being presented as a fact, but none of these animals can be considered safe. Safe is kind of a value judgment. What one person considers safe, another person doesn't necessarily, right? And so that's kind of an inherently loaded word. What does the author mean by safe? And also, none of these animals can be considered safe? The conclusion's always going to overstep in some way, right? And when you're trying to understand what an assumption is, and you may never get great at like predicting the assumption in a passage, that's fine. You may get really good at it. It's even better. But when you're trying to understand what an assumption really is, the conclusion gives the most away, because the conclusion is always going too far for whatever support is given for it in the passage. And it's not that the support is like faulty per se. The support's usually pretty good. It's that the support is lacking. There's not enough of it for that conclusion to stand up strong and tall, right? And looking at the conclusion for where it might have gone too broad, too extreme, too just out on a limb in some way, might have introduced a new term or any number of things like that, that gives you your window into what the author must have been thinking, but might have forgotten to say in terms of connecting from the premises that are already there supporting the conclusion to the conclusion itself. The assumption's always something the author forgot to say that really should like act as extra premises to better support that conclusion, right? Really, an assumption is something that must be true for that conclusion to have any chance of being valid, right? But assumption is just part of it, right? You do have to find the assumption questions, and there's a way to handle strengthen and weaken and evaluate questions that involves going through the assumption first. You absolutely don't need to. What you do need to know is when they ask you to strengthen the argument, they are very specifically asking you to strengthen the conclusion of the argument. And they're going to give you new information down there. And the question really is, which one gives you one more reason to believe that that conclusion the author reached is valid? Good strengthener doesn't save the argument. A good weakener doesn't obliterate the argument. But we have to have at least a little bit of support for that conclusion. But none of them are just going to say, yeah, none of these animals can be considered safe, right? You're not going to have an answer choice like that. That would be a bit too easy. And so instead, they're going to give you these kind of new anecdotal pieces of information, and you've got to interpret each one with real world inference and say, okay, does that say to me, yeah, you know what? Those animals might not be safe. None of those animals can really be considered safe, right? And that's what we're looking at the answer choices through the lens of. Kind of a like, if this is the case, then what? If last year several manatees were mysteriously killed by an unidentified toxin, then what? Bad news for manatees, right? Several more manatees might be equally mysteriously killed by this unidentified toxin. Fair to say from that, none of these animals can be considered safe? Somewhat, right? There's something to it, because like, you know, no number of Save the Manatee bumper stickers is going to save them from an unidentified toxin, right? So you keep A around for sure. And I'll usually do the answer choices for critical reasoning, especially in 2 passes. First pass, which ones can I easily eliminate? Second pass, among those left, now the real showdown, which one's going to get it done? All right, I've noticed we got different answers on this one. So A sticks around. B, all manatees swim at depths that make them vulnerable to the blades of motorboat engines. All right, so we're talking about manatees. They're swimming at depths that make them vulnerable. Now, vulnerable, definitely like relevant at least to safety, right? If they're vulnerable. And to the blades of motorboat engines sounds terrifying. But vulnerable is doing a lot of the work in this one to connect it to safety. So I'd keep B around on my first pass too, for sure. C, most tourists are unaware of the ongoing efforts to save the manatee. Most tourists are unaware of the ongoing efforts to save the manatee. The seeming implication of that, right? Real world inference from that is, so maybe the tourists are going to be part of the problem, right? But we don't know necessarily how tourists themselves, because this is kind of a new term in C, right? New information is not bad, but we've got to know its relevance, right? Hard to say how tourists fits into this, right? Are tourists people who like to play? Not really. They're people who like to go other places than the places where they actually live. And will a lack of knowledge be bad for saving the manatee? Possibly, but you have to assume quite a lot. If most tourists are unaware of the ongoing efforts to save the manatee, to really connect that to the argument, you have to think tourists are a big source of danger for manatees, and lack of awareness of the ongoing efforts means that they also are just kind of acting in a way that's inimical to the interests of the manatees, right? Whereas like you could be unaware of ongoing efforts to save the manatee and maybe still just be doing things that are manatee friendly. I'm not. I'm eating all their seaweed, but I assume some tourists are. So C is kind of a tough one to justify. You have to make a little more assumptions, like more assuming is done to connect C to the argument than say A and B, where A is talking about mysteriously killed, boom, directly relevant to safety. B is talking about vulnerable to blades, directly relevant to safety. C is not as directly relevant to safety unless you make extra assumptions about how dangerous tourists can be. And so it doesn't hold up against A and B. Sorry, C. I loved you once. The population of manatees in D in the wild has dwindled to fewer than 2,500 animals. Real world implication of that is the species is in trouble, right? It's like, oof, we're getting close to 0 there, and then what? Nobody knows, and hopefully we never will. Does it then help us justify the position that none of these animals can be considered safe? Not exactly the way that's phrased, right? Definitely could justify the position that the species is in maybe danger of extinction. We don't know really historical levels. Maybe there were only ever 2,600 of them, but probably it's bad, and it means the species is in danger of extinction. None of these animals can be considered safe, though, is a little bit tricky, because what that would mean is none of these 2,500 animals, or fewer than 2,500 animals, can be considered safe. And just knowing the fact that there are fewer than 2,500 animals doesn't itself mean that none of those fewer than 2,500 animals can be considered safe, not absent other information about actual threats to them. There could be fewer than 2,500 animals and their numbers could be like on the rebound or whatever, right? And so D tends to be a really, really tempting answer on this one, and it's easy to see why, because it's easy to conflate the species as a whole with these animals, right? But the distinction matters in D. These animals in the conclusion would be talking about these guys, and D doesn't talk about any danger to them except the overall danger of just being such a small number. E, although dozens of manatee deaths are documented each year, many more deaths go unreported. Grim. Now, what does that do to the argument? How does it match up? Well, it tells us that whatever we think is happening to manatees, it's worse. There are unreported ones out there. And that definitely feels like it contributes to the overall feeling of danger these animals are in, right? But does the fact that many more deaths go unreported add extra kind of credence to the proposition that they cannot be considered safe. These animals cannot be considered safe. Maybe. But is it as good as A and B? That's a tougher case to make, right? Dozens of manatee deaths are documented each year. Many more deaths go unreported. The passage seems to already kind of implicitly acknowledge, hey, there are conservation efforts, there are criminal penalties for harming these creatures. Like, we know there's a problem already, right? And E's telling us, yeah, but the problem might be even worse than what we've counted. It's okay. It doesn't necessarily imply that none of these animals, like on an individual level, can be considered safe. Especially given the extremeness of the conclusion. And now is when we start going over answer choices with a finer tooth comb. All right. Because A, B, and E are all kind of like talking danger for these manatees. But in E, we have dozens of manatee deaths and then many more deaths. Sounds bad, but is somewhat indefinite. In B, we have all manatees. But we also have this motorboat engines thing, which is unclearly related to the argument. And in A, we've got several manatees. In terms of scope, B beats A and E just by talking about all manatees. The conclusion is none of these animals can be considered safe. And if we, find out that all manatees are doing something that makes them vulnerable to danger, then it's fair to say then none of them can truly be considered safe, or at least there's one more reason to believe they can't be considered safe, because literally all of them swim at motorboat depth, right? Several manatees mysteriously killed by an unidentified toxin is a little hard. It's like if they had said some manatees were mysteriously killed by an unidentified toxin. It's bad for manatees. It doesn't do as much to justify the position that none of these animals can be considered safe. Right? Whereas if they are literally all vulnerable to the blades of motorboat things, and there's a little bit of a tie into motorboats with the whole warm coastal waters where people like to play, we're probably in somewhat better shape with that just because of the all manatees thing. And E, the same could be said. Dozens of manatee deaths documented each year, many more deaths go unreported. But does that mean that none of these animals can be considered safe? For all we know, that's just like normal manatee. I would imagine more than dozens die in a year, really. And so B ends up winning this one in what is not a very pleasant one. There are three answers that are kind of relevant to the conclusion. None of them is perfect, right? This motorboat thing is like, all right, we might have to accept that motorboats are there. If they are vulnerable to the blades of motorboat engines, the implication is kind of that there are motorboat engines there, because if there were no motorboat engines there, you wouldn't be vulnerable to them, they wouldn't be there, right? Like in the same way that they're not going to say that they swim at depths that make them vulnerable to like airplane engines or something. It wouldn't make any sense, right? And so B is kind of establishing that motorboat engines are a threat by saying that they're vulnerable to them. They have to be present for you to be vulnerable to them in all likelihood, or at least B can be read that way. And that's honestly one of the things, one of those last bridges I'm still trying to cross. Every test, I feel like, there's a critical reasoning question in which I go through the 5 answer choices and they all seem wrong. And part of that comes, I strongly suspect, from just slightly misinterpreting what they wanted me to interpret from an answer choice. And B is a really, really good example here, because two totally reasonable people could interpret B different ways. Saying they're vulnerable to blades of motorboat engines implies motorboat engines are there. Saying they're vulnerable to them doesn't imply that they're there. It just says like those depths are the depths that are known to be vulnerable to motorboat engines should motorboat engines ever come there. But because one of those reads is really good for the argument and it's a justified read, B ends up being justified as the best answer here. So we have to take these answer choices and always carry them to the next step. But there's a distinction between carrying them to like a reasonable next step and adding information to them to get them to the next step, the way we'd have to with C to say, oh yeah, and tourists who don't know things, they're going to be doing dangerous stuff, right? Don't know that for sure. Maybe it's slightly more likely, but it's possible they have nothing to do with manatees. And so you've got to add information. It's got to be somewhat reasonable as a like real world, conjecture to be drawn from the answer choices. But figuring out the line between doing that responsibly and making extra assumptions like you'd have to for C or D or something like that to make them work. That's a big part of the art of critical reasoning and a big part of what you're looking for in these conversations you have with yourself afterwards about why the right answer was right and why the wrong answer was wrong. Okay. Yeah, like exactly that point, LH. Sorry, I just saw your question, but I hopefully tried to address it preemptively, because that is the biggest objection you can make to B, and it's a legit one. Just, it can be read as establishing that motorboats are there by virtue of saying they're vulnerable to them. Like, basically, it's a question of whether we understand this as meaning they are actively vulnerable to motorboat engines, in which case B is a great answer, or they are potentially vulnerable to motorboat engines. And it doesn't say one way or the other, but because one of those interpretations like makes B a clearly better answer than A and E, it's a good reason to go with that read. And sometimes, again, sometimes you have to make those tough choices, right? And that's why differentiating right from wrong, even though it's last on the list, is gonna end up being the most important thing, because it's also the last frontier you'll cross in getting from V of whatever you're at to verbal of 90. All right, you guys. That is all. Thanks for coming to this presentation. You guys, if you are ever interested, Manhattan Prep offers free trial classes, free starter kits, and free discounts because we like you guys. I want you to like us too. All right. Hope everyone has a great rest of your day. And I look forward to seeing you at the next one, episode 3, Data Insights. The blind leading the blind. See you all then.